But to me, the central figure in all of this is definitely Leslie Wexner. I believe that he is the person that has been behind this from day one. Looking back on this story that I'm hearing more about, as I'm sure you are as well, he was the leader of the Jew Crew, as it was known, a group of affluent predators in the 1970s and 1980s, particularly in Chicago, that were sexually abusing underage boys, primarily in, I guess, Catholic dioceses. And this was just something that went on for a very long time. That's just one of many layers. And then you look into the fact that he was in charge of Victoria's Secret, which I'm sure has been nothing short of a grooming organization for many years. So where is your jump off point when it comes to somebody like Les Wexner? And do you believe that he in many ways is the ringleader of this entire clandestine U.S.-Israel operation, as Whitney Webb so eloquently puts it, one nation under blackmail?
Well, he's certainly more important than, you know, we have been led to believe, right? And, you know, this whole idea that, you know, why he would sign over his fortune to Jeffrey Epstein, there's a reason, right? I mean, there was a reason. He needed to do that for some reason. Somebody was making him do that. He had this fortune. He had all these mob ties. He had been implicated in a real grisly murder of his accountant, I believe, in the 80s. The Columbus Police Department had been doing a really heroic job trying to trace the links between these organized crime figures. He was deeply embedded in this organized crime crew that controlled commercial real estate and the mall business in the United States. And, you know, if you're looking for, I mean, this is the really troubling thing. If it's the 80s or the 70s and the 80s, and you are looking for prepubescent and pubescent victims, you know, where do you go, right? Like that is, and that's one of the things that is so, that I really feel like is so sort of uncovered here, because there was a very clear strategy that they used when they launched a brand. And the strategy was to sort of create this sort of cult-like following around the brand, and get and introduce kind of sex into the equation, and try and sort of, you know, get kids to work at their mall stores because they were so attracted to the image and the you know, the sexuality of the whole brand. And I'm thinking, you know, particularly Abercrombie and Fitch is what became so famous for having done that. And Abercrombie and Fitch,
Forever 21 is another one that comes to mind.
Right. And that, you know, and that was, again, and also obviously they're taking advantage, you know, they're, one of the things that is really important here, obviously, is the limited brands were the first really big vertically integrated, you know, entirely 100%, you know, outsourced clothing brands. So they had, you know, they were building factories in China, but they weren't, you know, they weren't sourcing from individual brands like a department store. The margins were so much higher if you could just, you know, sort of design your own clothes, build your own brand, and pay, you know, $5 a piece for you know, stuff that, and sell it for 40. They were experts at, you know, creating distance between themselves and the sweatshops that they were using to manufacture these clothes. They were experts at labor exploitation and exploitation generally. And, you know, with Abercrombie and Fitch, I remember, you know, getting really deep in that story when I worked at the Wall Street Journal as a retail reporter. They made the kids buy, like, you know, $300, $400 worth of clothing just to sort of walk through the door. And and the kids would almost never make back the amount of money that they spent on their clothes, because they didn't get, the model also required them to, hire so many kids and make sure that all of them were attractive, that a lot of kids would only get like 4 hours a week. So but underneath all of that, underneath this kind of cult, and it was, extremely discriminatory, unbelievably racist. I mean, the kinds of racism that you would hear about from Abercrombie and Fitch regional managers, the comments that they would, that they would repeat to me, were like nothing. I was working on this story back in 2001, 2002. It was like nothing I'd ever heard. It was the type of racism that I really, like, it seemed like something from the 20s. But it was very apparent because the stores oftentimes had no, non-white employees working there. Or all of their non-white employees were literally working in the back room,
Right.
stocking, and they weren't actually allowed to like be up front and be the face of the brand. Well, underneath all of this, right, this really, this vast edifice of, created insecurity and brand cultishness and racism and bad vibes and labor exploitation, you also had a massive sex trafficking ring, right? And this came out, way after the Epstein stuff started to blow. This is a company, this is all run by the CEO of Abercrombie and Fitch, who was an extremely eccentric and crazy kind of closeted gay man. But he had been personally sort of plucked from obscurity to build this brand by Les Wexner and himself. It was all happening in New Albany and Columbus kind of concurrently with the Epstein scheme. And they were using all of the same sort of strategies, but it was more preying on young men. It wasn't, that Mike Jeffries, the CEO, was gay. And Les Wexner, gay. So there is, there are, I think that's one of the reasons that Wexner has not been, featured that prominently so far in our, in the narrative that we understand of Epstein, because he had a different group of victims. And men are, and this sort of goes also for a lot of stuff that happened after the non-prosecution agreement, right? So there was this whole other set of victims. Most of the victims that we are familiar with, the ones that are standing behind Pramila Jayapal, and there's about 20 that have come out and been on TV and told their story, told at least a little bit of their story. And they're almost all American. They're almost all American born. They encountered Epstein either through Ghislaine in Manhattan, or working retail there, or they were scouted at the middle school near his home in Palm Beach. But there's like these other whole universes of victims coming from Russia and Moldova and Romania and Slovakia and Slovenia, who haven't told their side of the story. And why is that? Well, I mean, a lot of that is because over when these women come to New York, they are, they come on tourist visas. They don't have any way of making money. They can't go bartend. They can't go, work in a restaurant like any normal gorgeous girl in Manhattan. They are, and they're sort of subject. They're at the mercy of these agents that brought them over. People like Jean-Luc Brunel, who was of course a huge fighter for the Victoria's Secret. So there is, there's a whole universe of victims, and these women generally got in a little deeper. Maybe they were also recruited other girls, maybe they are afraid that, they aren't pure victims. They stayed too long. They weren't able to break free. They're still scared. And there's a lot of names that we know, but we haven't really gotten a great sense of what all we know about how that operation worked is from the American girls who witnessed it. And one of Leon Black's, because I think that Leon Black is likely also pretty deep into this organization.
Very
And one
much.
thing about Leon Black that I'm not sure are you aware of Leon's father?
No.
Leon's father, Eli Black, was a titan of industry, of the sort of early private equity business model of buying up a bunch of companies with borrowed money, essentially, and they would always buy a bunch of different companies in completely different sectors because there were pretty strict anti-merger laws at the time. And Eli Black, he was a rabbi. He was he was a very prominent Zionist. But his passion was, accounting, and this kind of early, this early form of private equity deal that, was, sort of adjacent to kind of the mob. They were a little bit, they were like mafia bust outs, but legal, right? Is pretty much the business he was in. So he purchased a bunch of companies, a huge meatpacking plant, and then he purchased United Fruit. So, extremely famous, sort of, CIA entrenched, company. And he, but, he this was in the 70s, I believe, that he purchased it. So sort of past its prime, and the Central American countries were getting together and doing something that they really, should have done already, which was agree on for tourism, especially, which was agree on a unified tariff regime, where they were going to have a common regional tariff on the bananas, and that way, they were going to be able to fund their social safety nets and education systems and stuff like that. And they weren't going to allow, competition to undermine that. And Eli Black bribed some kind of like a warlord, I want to say in Guatemala, but it could be at Honduras. He bribed somebody who eventually became prime minister, as it happens, to back out of the tariff regime, and he spent a lot of money on that bribe. I want to say it was like $2 million. It was a big deal. And it was the 70s. We were, super woke back then. Somebody caught wind of this. There were congressional hearings, and he came under scrutiny. This is when they actually passed the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Anyway, this is going on. Eli Black commits suicide by walking out of his 44th story office window, breaking through the window and walking out with his briefcase, and falling 44 stories.
When was that?
This 75.
Okay.
About 75. So that it's either 75 or 77, but I think it's 75. Anyway, that happens. There's nothing, it looks a little suspicious, but it's definitely suicide. He was definitely feeling depressed over this, this scandal, which is okay. Eli Black was some kind of asset himself. Somebody killed Eli Black. That's that's not a normal way to kill yourself. It's, if you're depressed people, I mean, you got to go through the glass. But it's such a similar tale to the one that Ghislaine had about her own her own father, was this Mossad super spy, absolutely 40-year asset to Israel and to the United States as well, and to the whole kind of Western, hegemony. And then, he asks, like, he gets in financial trouble. He asked them to bail him out. I think that he asked for $400 million or something like that. It was a little bit too much. And they said, okay, no, fuck you. We're like, goodbye. This is what happens to assets. And the same thing then, of course, happens to Jeffrey Epstein. But I think that there is like this extra sadism and nihilism among, people who sort of are reared thinking that they're extremely special and extremely, like blessed in some way, and then get discarded just like any old trash. And I do feel like there's something about the way that Ghislaine operated, and like, and Epstein was a lot more, the way that Ghislaine operated and the way that that Leon Black operated. They were just so they just really did believe that that their victims were trash, were like human refuse,
Well, that's an example of exactly the type of treatment that you see constantly from this cabal of Zionist Jews who constantly talk about Palestinians like they're not human. Like, 80,000 here, 100,000 there. And then you see what happens in DC with the two Israeli Jewish nationalists that were gunned down, apparently, and the whole world had to stop. Basically, everything was all about, oh, could you believe that this happened? Yeah, 100,000 Palestinian victims were killed. No one blinks an eye. No one thinks anything of it. And I think that that's what's basically been embedded into so many of these people's minds. As Jen, as you grew up in that environment where Palestinians were not regarded as human, basically.
Well, they weren't referred to as Palestinians. They were Arabs. Palestinians didn't exist. That's not a thing. That's pretend. And no, what we're dealing, this is all, whether it's white supremacy or Jewish supremacy, at the end of the day, that's what we're talking about here. And so to these people in this class, and that's also a big part of it, is we know this is a class thing. People beneath them are completely expendable.